The Spitfire was dying. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kendrick could feel it in every shudder of the control stick, every cough of the Merlin engine as it struggled to keep running with a cylinder head blown apart by German flak. Black smoke poured from the cowling, obscuring his vision, filling the cockpit with the acrid smell of burning oil and hot metal. He was at 8,000 feet and losing altitude fast, the French countryside spinning slowly beneath him as he fought to keep the aircraft level. His radio was dead, his compass shattered by shrapnel, and he had no idea exactly where he was except somewhere deep in enemy territory. The mission, a fighter sweep over a German airfield near Amiens, had gone catastrophically wrong when they'd flown into a flak trap, and now Kendrick was paying the price. Friends, like and subscribe to the channel, and we will continue. He considered his options, with the cold calculation that 2 years of combat flying had taught him. He could try to nurse the Spitfire back toward England, but the channel was at least 80 miles away, and the engine was failing rapidly. He could bail out now while he still had altitude, but that meant abandoning his aircraft and becoming a prisoner of war. Or he could try to crash land, which might kill him, but at least gave him a chance of evading capture. The decision was made for him when the engine seized completely with a grinding metallic shriek, the propeller windmilling uselessly as the Spitfire transformed from a fighter aircraft into an expensive glider. Kendrick pushed the stick forward, trading altitude for airspeed, scanning the ground below for anything that might serve as a landing site. There, a field, relatively flat, recently plowed by the look of it. Not ideal, but better than trees or buildings. He aimed for it, fighting the controls as the Spitfire dropped like a stone, the wind screaming past the canopy. At 200 feet, he could see details: furrows in the soil, a farmhouse in the distance, a road lined with poplar trees. At 100 feet, he pulled back on the stick, flaring the aircraft, trying to bleed off speed. The Spitfire hit hard, bounced, hit again, the landing gear collapsing immediately as the aircraft plowed through the soft earth. Kendrick's head smashed against the canopy frame despite his harness, stars exploding across his vision. The world became a chaos of noise and violence, metal tearing, earth flying, the aircraft spinning as it disintegrated around him. Then silence. Kendrick hung in his harness, blood running down his face from a gash above his eye, his left shoulder screaming with pain. But he was alive. He fumbled with the harness release, dropped into the crumpled cockpit, and kicked at the canopy until it popped free. He crawled out onto the wing, dropped to the ground, and immediately fell as his left leg refused to support his weight. Sprained ankle, maybe broken. He forced himself up, limping away from the wreckage. Standard procedure: get away from the aircraft, find civilian clothes, make contact with the resistance, begin the long journey back to England. He'd been briefed on escape and evasion procedures dozens of times, but theory was about to meet reality in the harshest possible way. He made it perhaps 200 yards before he heard the dogs. German voices shouting, the distinctive sound of military vehicles. They'd seen him come down, had been waiting. Of course they had. This area was crawling with German troops, and a crashing Spitfire was hardly subtle. Kendrick tried to run, but his injured leg betrayed him, and he collapsed in the mud. He reached for his service revolver, thinking briefly of resistance. But what was the point? He was one injured pilot with a 6-shot pistol against what sounded like a full infantry squad. He raised his hands as German soldiers surrounded him, their rifles pointed at his chest, their faces hard and professional. One of them, an Unteroffizier, stepped forward and removed Kendrick's revolver, then searched him efficiently, removing his maps, his compass, his escape kit. "For Sie ist der Krieg vorbei," the German said. "For you, the war is over." Kendrick was hauled to his feet, his arms bound behind his back, and pushed toward a waiting truck. As they drove away, he caught a last glimpse of his Spitfire, broken and smoking in the field, and felt a profound sense of loss. That aircraft had been his companion, his weapon, his shield for 18 months of combat. Now it was scrap metal, and he was a prisoner. But as the truck bounced along the rutted road toward whatever fate awaited him, Thomas Kendrick made a decision. The Germans might have captured his body, but they hadn't captured his mind. He was still a British officer, still at war, and if he couldn't fight with guns and aircraft anymore, he would fight with the only weapon he had left: deception. He had no idea yet how he would do it, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would find a way. The war, for him, was far from over. The journey from France to Germany took 3 days, 3 days of military trucks, railway cars, and brief stops at local jails, where Kendrick was held in cells that stank of urine and despair. His injuries were treated perfunctorily, his head wound cleaned and bandaged, his ankle wrapped, but he received no real medical attention. The Germans weren't cruel, just indifferent. He was processed like cargo, moved from point to point with bureaucratic efficiency. Other prisoners joined him along the way: an American B-17 gunner with burns on his hands, a Canadian pilot who'd been shot down over Belgium, a British navigator who sat in silence, staring at nothing. They weren't allowed to speak to each other, and guards enforced the rule with rifle butts when necessary. Finally, they arrived at Dulag Luft, Durchgangslager der Luftwaffe, the transit camp for captured Allied airmen. It was located in Oberursel, a small town near Frankfurt, and it served as the Luftwaffe's primary interrogation center for Allied aircrew before they were sent to permanent prisoner-of-war camps. The facility was surprisingly well organized: neat buildings surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers at regular intervals, German personnel moving with crisp military precision. Kendrick and the other prisoners were separated immediately upon arrival, each taken to a different building. The message was clear: you are alone now, isolated, cut off from your comrades. It was psychological warfare, and Kendrick recognized it for what it was. He was placed in a cell, solitary confinement, approximately 6 feet by 10 feet, containing only a narrow bed, a small table, and a bucket. The walls were painted white, almost blindingly so, and a single barred window near the ceiling let in a shaft of pale sunlight. The temperature was stifling. The Germans kept the heat turned up deliberately, another psychological tactic designed to make prisoners uncomfortable and more willing to talk. Kendrick sat on the bed and took stock of his situation. He was injured, exhausted, alone in enemy territory, and about to be interrogated by professionals who had been doing this job for years. The odds were not in his favor. But Kendrick had advantages the Germans didn't know about. Before the war, he had studied psychology at Cambridge, fascinated by how the human mind worked, how people could be influenced and manipulated. He'd never finished his degree. The war had interrupted his studies. But he'd learned enough to understand the basics of interrogation techniques. He knew they would try to isolate him, disorient him, make him feel helpless and alone. They would offer friendship, understanding, perhaps even sympathy. They would pretend to know more than they actually did, hoping he would fill in the gaps. And they would be patient, because time was on their side. A prisoner with no hope of escape, no contact with the outside world, would eventually talk. Everyone did, eventually. Unless, Kendrick thought, the prisoner wanted to talk. Unless the prisoner had something to say that the interrogators wanted to hear. Unless the prisoner could turn the interrogation into a weapon, feeding the Germans information that seemed valuable but was actually carefully crafted deception. It was a dangerous game, one that could backfire spectacularly if he wasn't careful. But it was also an opportunity. The Germans would expect him to resist, to give only name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. They wouldn't expect him to cooperate, to seem eager to share information. And that unexpected cooperation might just be the key to making them believe whatever he told them. The idea crystallized in Kendrick's mind as he sat in that sweltering cell. He would become a collaborator, or at least appear to be one. He would give the Germans what they wanted: information about RAF operations, tactics, equipment, plans. But every piece of information would be false, carefully constructed to mislead and confuse. He would mix truth with lies so skillfully that the interrogators wouldn't be able to tell the difference. He would seem reluctant at first, then gradually break down, giving them the impression that they had successfully cracked him. And all the while, he would be feeding them a steady diet of misinformation that would waste their time, misdirect their intelligence efforts, and perhaps even influence their strategic decisions. It was audacious, probably insane, and extremely dangerous. If the Germans discovered what he was doing, they would likely execute him as a spy. But doing nothing, simply enduring imprisonment, while his comrades continued to fight and die, was intolerable. Thomas Kendrick had always been a fighter. Now he would fight with lies instead of bullets. The cell door opened, and a German officer entered, a Hauptmann, captain, wearing the uniform of the Luftwaffe Intelligence Service. He was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a folder under his arm and moved with the confident bearing of someone who was very good at his job. "Flight Lieutenant Kendrick," he said in excellent English with only a slight accent. "I am Hauptmann Richter. Welcome to Dulag Luft. I hope your journey was not too uncomfortable." His tone was polite, almost friendly, as if they were meeting at a social function rather than an interrogation center. Kendrick said nothing, just stared at him with what he hoped was a mixture of fear and defiance. Richter smiled slightly, pulled out the chair from the small table, and sat down. "We have much to discuss, you and I," he said, opening the folder. "Let us begin." Hauptmann Richter spread several documents across the small table with deliberate care, arranging them so Kendrick could see aerial photographs, squadron rosters, and what appeared to be intelligence reports. It was a classic interrogation technique. Display knowledge to intimidate the prisoner, make him believe resistance was futile, because the Germans already knew everything. Kendrick recognized the tactic immediately, but pretended not to, keeping his expression neutral while his mind raced. Some of the documents were genuine. He could see photographs of RAF airfields he recognized. Others were clearly fabricated or outdated. Richter was fishing, trying to gauge what Kendrick knew and what he might reveal. "You are from number 611 Squadron, based at Biggin Hill," Richter said, not asking, but stating. "You fly Spitfire Mark VB aircraft. Your squadron commander is Wing Commander Johnson, and you have been operational since September 1941. You have 7 confirmed kills and 2 probables. Your aircraft serial number was EN821, and you were shot down during a fighter sweep over the Amiens area on March 18th at approximately 14:30 hours. Is this information correct?" He looked at Kendrick expectantly, his expression mild and professional. Kendrick felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Most of that information was accurate, which meant the Germans had good intelligence sources, or they were very good at piecing together fragments of information from multiple prisoners. Kendrick remained silent, staring at a point on the wall above Richter's head. The Geneva Convention required him to provide only his name, rank, and serial number. Everything else was voluntary. Richter seemed unsurprised by the silence. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, studying Kendrick with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "You understand, of course, that your silence changes nothing," he said conversationally. "We already know these facts. Your cooperation, or lack thereof, is irrelevant to our intelligence gathering. However, it is very relevant to your comfort and treatment here. Cooperative prisoners are treated well, better food, medical attention, books, even letters from home eventually. Uncooperative prisoners remain in solitary confinement indefinitely. It is your choice." It was a lie, of course, or at least a half-truth. The Geneva Convention guaranteed certain rights to prisoners of war regardless of their cooperation. But Kendrick knew that the Germans could make his life miserable in countless small ways without technically violating international law. And more importantly, Richter's statement revealed something crucial. The Germans wanted information badly enough to offer incentives for it. That meant Kendrick had leverage, something to trade. He just had to be careful about how he used it. He let the silence stretch out for another minute, then spoke for the first time. "Flight Lieutenant Thomas Kendrick, service number 1127634, he said, his voice hoarse from 3 days without much water. Richter smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, we know this already. I am asking for your cooperation in clarifying certain technical matters. For example, we are curious about the new modifications to the Spitfire Mark IX. We know this aircraft has been introduced into service, but we lack details about its performance characteristics. Surely there is no harm in discussing technical specifications. Such information does not compromise military operations." It was a clever approach, asking for information that seemed innocuous, technical rather than tactical, the kind of thing that might not seem like a betrayal. But Kendrick knew that technical intelligence was often the most valuable kind. Performance data on the Spitfire IX would help German engineers design better fighters and help German pilots develop better tactics. Kendrick said nothing, and after a moment, Richter stood up, gathering his documents. "Very well. I will leave you to think about your situation. We will speak again tomorrow. Perhaps after another night in this cell, you will be more inclined to have a reasonable conversation." He walked to the door, knocked twice, and waited for the guard to unlock it. Just before leaving, he turned back. "One more thing, Flight Lieutenant. You should know that we have captured several other pilots from your squadron in recent weeks. Some of them have been quite forthcoming with information. We are simply asking you to confirm what we already know. Think about that. The door closed behind him with a solid metallic click, and Kendrick was alone again. He lay back on the narrow bed, his mind working furiously. Richter's final statement was almost certainly a bluff. If the Germans really had information from other 611 squadron pilots, they wouldn't need Kendrick's confirmation. But it was a psychologically effective bluff, designed to make him feel that resistance was pointless, that his comrades had already betrayed everything, so he might as well do the same. It wouldn't work, but it told Kendrick something important about Richter. He was skilled, experienced, and willing to use sophisticated psychological manipulation. That made him dangerous, but it also made him potentially vulnerable to counter-manipulation. If Kendrick could convince Richter that he was breaking down, that he was ready to cooperate, then the German might lower his guard and accept false information as genuine. The next morning, or what Kendrick assumed was morning, since the cell had no clock and the window was too high to see the sun's position, Richter returned. This time he brought a tray with bread, cheese, and real coffee, luxuries that made Kendrick's mouth water after days of watery soup and stale bread. "I thought we might have breakfast together," Richter said pleasantly, setting the tray on the table. "Civilized men can discuss matters in a civilized manner, yes?" He poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward Kendrick, and sat down. "I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Perhaps I was asking the wrong questions. Let me try a different approach. Tell me about yourself, Flight Lieutenant. Where are you from? What did you do before the war? Do you have family?" It was a classic rapport-building technique, shifting from confrontational interrogation to friendly conversation, trying to establish a personal connection that would make Kendrick more willing to share information. But it was also an opening, an opportunity to begin implementing his plan. Kendrick reached for the coffee cup, took a sip. It was genuinely good coffee. German ersatz, perhaps, but still far better than what he'd been given. And made a decision. He would give Richter what he wanted. He would start talking. But everything he said would be carefully calculated to serve his own purposes. The game was beginning, and Thomas Kendrick intended to win. Kendrick began slowly, carefully, like a man reluctantly surrendering to inevitable defeat. He told Richter about his childhood in Sussex, his years at Cambridge, his decision to join the RAF when war broke out. All of it was true, verifiable information that the Germans could check through Red Cross records or other sources. He spoke haltingly, as if each word was being dragged from him against his will. And he watched Richter's reactions carefully. The German interrogator listened with apparent sympathy, nodding occasionally, asking gentle follow-up questions that seemed more like friendly interest than professional interrogation. It was masterfully done, and Kendrick had to remind himself that this pleasant, cultured man was his enemy. Over the following days, Richter returned regularly, always bringing small comforts, better food, cigarettes, a book to read. The cell temperature was lowered to something more tolerable. Kendrick was allowed to shower and shave, given clean clothes. Each improvement was presented as a reward for cooperation, a demonstration that the Germans treated reasonable prisoners well. And gradually, carefully, Kendrick began to reveal more information. He talked about his training, about the airfields where he'd been stationed, about the daily routine of squadron life. Most of it was mundane. the kind of information that appeared in newspapers or could be observed by anyone living near an RAF base. But mixed in were small technical details that seemed more significant. He mentioned almost casually that the Spitfire Mark IX had been experiencing engine problems, that pilots were complaining about reliability issues with the new Merlin 61 engine. This was completely false. The Mark IX was actually performing superbly. But Kendrick delivered the lie with just the right mixture of reluctance and resignation, as if he felt guilty about betraying this information but couldn't help himself. Richter's eyes had sharpened with interest, and he'd asked several follow-up questions, which Kendrick answered with carefully crafted details. He described fictional overheating problems, imaginary failures of the supercharger system, non-existent maintenance difficulties. All of it sounded plausible because Kendrick knew enough about aircraft engines to make his lies technically convincing. Richter recorded everything meticulously in his notebook, and Kendrick felt a surge of satisfaction. The German believed him. Why wouldn't he? Kendrick was displaying all the classic signs of a prisoner who had been successfully broken. Initial resistance followed by gradual capitulation, reluctance mixed with a desire to please his interrogator, small revelations leading to larger ones. It was textbook behavior, exactly what Richter had been trained to recognize as genuine cooperation. The interrogator had no reason to suspect that Kendrick was feeding him deliberate misinformation, because prisoners simply didn't do that. They either resisted or they broke. The idea that someone might pretend to break while actually conducting a sophisticated deception operation was outside the normal paradigm of interrogation. After 2 weeks, Richter brought another officer to the interrogation sessions, Oberleutnant Weber, a younger man who specialized in technical intelligence. Weber was less personable than Richter, more focused on specific details about aircraft performance, weapon systems, and tactical procedures. Kendrick recognized this as a new phase of the interrogation. Now that Richter had established rapport and broken down Kendrick's resistance, Weber would extract the detailed technical information that was the real goal. It was exactly what Kendrick had been hoping for. Weber's questions gave him a clear picture of what the Germans knew, what they suspected, and what gaps existed in their intelligence. And those gaps were opportunities to plant misinformation. Weber was particularly interested in the new tactics RAF Fighter Command was supposedly developing for bomber escort missions. Kendrick pretended to know very little about this. He was just a fighter pilot after all, not a tactical planner. But he let slip fragments of information that suggested the RAF was planning to use large formations of fighters, flying close escort to bomber streams, staying tight with the bombers, rather than ranging ahead to engage German fighters. This was precisely the opposite of what Fighter Command was actually planning. The real strategy was to send fighters ahead of the bombers to clear the skies of German interceptors, giving the bombers a clear run to their targets. But if the Germans believed the RAF would use close escort tactics, they might develop countermeasures that would be completely ineffective against the actual strategy. Kendrick also mentioned, with apparent reluctance, that the RAF was having difficulties with its new long-range drop tanks, which were supposed to extend the range of escort fighters. He described fictional problems with tank separation, fuel flow issues, and structural failures that were forcing Fighter Command to reconsider its entire escort strategy. In reality, the drop tanks were working well, and would soon enable RAF fighters to escort bombers deep into Germany. But if the Germans believed the British were having problems with this technology, they might underestimate the threat and fail to prepare adequate defenses for their interior targets. Every lie Kendrick told was designed to mislead, to waste German resources, to give the RAF an advantage. Richter and Weber seemed pleased with Kendrick's cooperation. They began treating him less like a prisoner and more like a colleague, discussing aviation matters with genuine interest, sometimes even debating technical points as if they were all engineers working on the same problems rather than enemies at war. Kendrick played along, gradually becoming more animated in these discussions, showing enthusiasm for technical details, even offering opinions on German aircraft he'd encountered in combat. He praised the Focke-Wulf 190, criticized the Messerschmitt 109's limited range, and discussed tactics with the analytical detachment of a professional pilot. It was all part of the performance, designed to make Richter and Weber see him as a trustworthy source of information. But beneath the surface, Kendrick was constantly calculating, weighing every word, considering how each piece of information would be interpreted and used. He was walking a tightrope, and one mistake could expose the entire deception. If he contradicted himself, if he revealed something that the Germans could immediately verify as false, if he seemed too eager to cooperate or too knowledgeable about matters beyond his rank and position, the game would be over. He had to be consistent, plausible, and careful. The mental strain was exhausting, far more tiring than any physical hardship. Every conversation with Richter and Weber required intense concentration, and afterward Kendrick would lie on his bunk feeling drained, reviewing everything he'd said, checking for errors or inconsistencies that might have raised suspicion. By late April, Kendrick had been at Dulag Luft for 6 weeks. He knew this couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, he would be transferred to a permanent POW camp, and his opportunity to feed misinformation to German intelligence would end. But he also knew that every day he kept the Germans believing his lies was a day when their intelligence assessments would be flawed, their tactical decisions based on false premises, their strategic planning compromised by bad information. He was one man, alone and powerless, but he was still fighting. And in his own small way, he was winning. Kendrick's success with Richter and Weber gave him confidence, but it also created a new problem. The Germans were becoming too dependent on him as a source. Other prisoners were arriving at Dulag Luft regularly. The air war over Europe was intensifying, and Allied losses were mounting. But Richter seemed to prefer interrogating Kendrick, returning to him again and again with new questions. This was dangerous for 2 reasons. First, the more Kendrick talked, the greater the chance he would make a mistake and expose his deception. Second, he was only one voice, and the Germans would eventually cross-reference his information with what other prisoners told them. If his lies contradicted what others said, the discrepancies would raise red flags. Kendrick needed to expand his operation to bring other prisoners into the deception. But how? He was kept in solitary confinement with no contact with other Allied airmen except for brief glimpses during trips to the washroom or exercise yard. The Germans maintained strict separation to prevent prisoners from coordinating their stories. Yet Kendrick knew that communication between prisoners was possible. He'd been briefed on it during his escape and evasion training. Prisoners developed elaborate systems of signals, hidden messages, even codes tapped on walls. The question was whether he could use these methods to recruit others into his scheme without alerting the German guards. The opportunity came unexpectedly. During one of his exercise periods, 30 minutes walking in circles in a small courtyard, Kendrick noticed another prisoner being escorted to the adjacent yard. The man was an American, a B-17 pilot, judging by his flight jacket, and he looked relatively fresh, probably recently captured. The 2 yards were separated by a chain-link fence, and guards watched both areas carefully. But for a brief moment, the guards' attention was elsewhere. Kendrick moved close to the fence and spoke quietly without looking directly at the American. "Don't react. Don't look at me. Just listen." The American, to his credit, kept walking as if he'd heard nothing, but Kendrick saw the slight tension in his shoulders that indicated he was paying attention. "They'll interrogate you," Kendrick continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hauptmann Richter, very smooth, very friendly. He'll try to make you talk. When you do, and you will, everyone does, give him false information. Mix it with truth, but lie about anything important. Technical specs, tactics, future operations. Make it plausible. Make him believe you." The American gave the slightest nod, so subtle it might have been imagination. Then the guards called time, and both prisoners were escorted back to their cells. Kendrick had no idea if the message had been understood, if the American would follow through, or if the man would simply think Kendrick was insane. But he'd planted a seed. Over the following weeks, Kendrick made contact with 3 more prisoners during brief moments in the exercise yard or washroom: a Canadian navigator, a British bomb aimer, and another American pilot. To each he delivered the same whispered message: cooperate with the interrogators, but lie about everything important. He had no way to coordinate the specific lies they would tell, no way to ensure consistency, and that worried him. But he also realized that some inconsistency might actually help. If every prisoner told exactly the same lies, it would seem suspicious, rehearsed. But if different prisoners told different lies, all plausible but contradictory, it would create confusion in German intelligence assessments. The Germans would waste time trying to reconcile conflicting reports, and in that confusion, the truth would be obscured. Kendrick's gamble paid off in an unexpected way. During one interrogation session, Richter seemed troubled, less confident than usual. "I must ask you about something," the German said, frowning at his notes. "You told us that the Spitfire Mark IX was experiencing engine reliability problems. But we have recently interrogated an American pilot who claims that his unit encountered Mark IXs over France last week, and these aircraft performed exceptionally well, with no apparent mechanical issues. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Kendrick's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. This was the moment he'd been dreading. His lies were being checked against other sources. He had to think fast. "When was this encounter?" Kendrick asked, stalling for time. Richter consulted his notes. "April 29th, over the Abbeville area." Kendrick nodded slowly, as if considering. "That would have been 611 Squadron, probably, or possibly 64 Squadron. They both operate in that sector. Look, Hauptmann, I can only tell you what I know from my own experience, and what I heard from other pilots in my squadron. We were having problems with the Mark IX back in March. It's possible, probable even, that those problems have been fixed by now. The RAF works very quickly when there's a mechanical issue, Or maybe different squadrons had different experiences. I don't know what to tell you, except what I saw and heard myself. It was a masterful recovery, and Kendrick could see Richter considering it. The explanation was plausible. Mechanical problems could be fixed. Different units could have different experiences. And Kendrick was only reporting what he personally knew. More importantly, Kendrick's apparent confusion and uncertainty made him seem more credible, not less. A prisoner who was lying would have defended his story more vigorously, would have insisted he was right. Kendrick's willingness to admit he might be wrong, that his information might be outdated or incomplete, actually reinforced the impression that he was telling the truth as he understood it. Richter made a note and moved on to other questions, and Kendrick breathed an internal sigh of relief. But the incident taught him something important. The misinformation campaign was working, but it was also creating complications. The Germans were now receiving conflicting intelligence from multiple sources, and they were trying to make sense of it. This was good. Confusion was the goal, but it also meant Kendrick had to be even more careful. He began adjusting his approach, admitting more often that his information might be incomplete or outdated, positioning himself as a source who was honest about the limitations of his knowledge. This paradoxically made him seem more reliable, because truly honest sources acknowledge uncertainty rather than claiming to know everything. By mid-May, Kendrick estimated that he had successfully recruited at least 4 other prisoners into his deception operation, though he had no way to communicate with them further or coordinate their efforts. He had to trust that they understood the mission and would carry it out. Meanwhile, his own interrogations continued, and he fed Richter and Weber a steady stream of misinformation about RAF tactics, aircraft performance, and operational planning. He told them that Fighter Command was planning a major offensive against German naval bases in Norway. Completely false. He described a new air-to-air rocket weapon that was supposedly in development. Pure fiction. He mentioned that RAF bomber crews were being trained for low-level precision attacks on German dams. Actually true, but he described the wrong dams and the wrong tactics, ensuring that even this grain of truth would mislead. Each lie was carefully crafted to be plausible, to fit with what the Germans already knew or suspected, and to waste their resources. If they believed the RAF was planning to attack Norway, they might reinforce defenses there at the expense of other areas. If they thought the British were developing air-to-air rockets, they might divert research resources to countermeasures. If they expected attacks on the wrong dams using the wrong tactics, they might prepare defenses that would be useless against the actual operation. Kendrick had no way of knowing whether his misinformation was actually reaching German high command, whether it was influencing real decisions, but he had to believe it was making a difference. The alternative, that his efforts were meaningless, that he was just a prisoner telling lies to pass the time, was too depressing to contemplate. In late May, Richter informed Kendrick that he would soon be transferred to a permanent POW camp. "You have been very cooperative, Flight Lieutenant," the German said, with what seemed like genuine warmth. "I want you to know that your information has been valuable to us. I will ensure that your cooperation is noted in your file and that you are treated well at your new location." Kendrick nodded, playing the role of the broken prisoner who had found a kind of peace in collaboration. But inside, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the intense mental strain of the interrogations would soon end. Satisfaction that he had successfully deceived his interrogators for nearly 3 months. And uncertainty about what came next. In the POW camp, he would have no more opportunities to feed misinformation to German intelligence. His private war would be over, or would it? As Kendrick lay on his bunk that night, he began to think about the possibilities. A POW camp would have hundreds of Allied prisoners, many of them officers with knowledge of military operations. It would also have German guards, administrators, and probably intelligence officers conducting ongoing interrogations. What if the deception operation could continue there? What if Kendrick could organize a systematic campaign of misinformation involving dozens or even hundreds of prisoners? The idea was audacious, probably impossible, but it wouldn't leave his mind. Thomas Kendrick had discovered that he had a talent for deception, and he wasn't ready to stop using it. The game was far from over. The train journey from Oberursel to Sagan took most of a day, passing through countryside that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Kendrick traveled in a passenger car with 24 other prisoners, all recently processed through Dulag Luft, all bound for Stalag Luft III, the Luftwaffe's largest prisoner of war camp for captured Allied airmen. The guards were relatively relaxed during the journey, allowing the prisoners to talk among themselves, and Kendrick used the opportunity to observe his fellow captives. Most were British or American, though he spotted a few Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. They were young men, most in their early 20s, and they wore their captivity with varying degrees of resignation and defiance. Kendrick recognized 2 of the prisoners from Dulag Luft, the Canadian navigator, and one of the American pilots he'd made contact with during exercise periods. He caught the Canadian's eye briefly and received a barely perceptible nod. Good. At least some of his recruits had survived the interrogation process and were being sent to the same camp. That would make things easier. During the journey, Kendrick listened carefully to the conversations around him, learning what he could about Stalag Luft III. The camp was huge, apparently, with several compounds housing thousands of prisoners. It was well organized, with a complex internal structure of prisoner leadership, escape committees, and various recreational activities. The Germans ran it relatively efficiently, adhering mostly to Geneva Convention standards, though conditions were hardly comfortable. When they arrived at Sagan Station, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for the short drive to the camp. Kendrick's first view of Stalag Luft III was sobering. Vast expanses of barbed wire, guard towers every 100 yards, searchlights, and beyond the wire, rows of long wooden barracks stretching into the distance. The camp was divided into separate compounds: North Compound for RAF officers, South Compound for American officers, East Compound for NCOs. Kendrick and most of the British officers were assigned to North Compound, which already housed about 800 men. As they were processed through the camp administration, more paperwork, more photographs, more bureaucratic ritual, Kendrick studied the German personnel carefully. These weren't the sophisticated intelligence officers of Dulag Luft. These were camp administrators, guards, functionaries. But somewhere in this vast complex, there had to be intelligence officers conducting ongoing interrogations, trying to extract information from prisoners about new developments in Allied air operations. North Compound consisted of 15 barracks, each housing about 50 men in cramped conditions. Kendrick was assigned to Hut 104, Room 7, which he would share with 11 other officers. When he arrived at the hut carrying his meager possessions, a blanket, a tin cup, a spoon, he was greeted by a tall, lean man with a squadron leader's insignia and an air of quiet authority. "Thomas Kendrick, I presume," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Roger Bushell. Welcome to the Ritz." His tone was sardonic, but not unfriendly. Kendrick shook his hand, recognizing the name. Squadron leader Roger Bushell was something of a legend. A fighter pilot who'd been shot down in 1940, escaped from a German POW camp, been recaptured, and was now the senior British officer in North Compound and the head of the escape committee. Bushell showed Kendrick to his bunk, a narrow wooden frame with a thin mattress, and introduced him to the other men in the room. They were a diverse group: pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, all shot down at various times over the past 2 years, all adapting to prison life in their own ways. Some were working on escape plans, digging tunnels, or forging documents. Others had resigned themselves to sitting out the war, focusing on education, sports, or theater productions. Kendrick listened and observed, saying little, trying to understand the social dynamics of this strange community. After dinner, a watery soup and a small piece of black bread. Bushell took Kendrick aside for a private conversation. "I make it my business to know about new arrivals," Bushell said quietly. "I've heard some interesting things about you, Kendrick. Word travels, even from Dulag Luft. Some of the chaps who came through before you mentioned that you were encouraging prisoners to feed false information to the Germans. Is that true?" Kendrick felt a jolt of alarm. He'd been careful, so careful, but apparently not careful enough. His whispered conversations in the exercise yard had been noticed and remembered. He considered denying it, but something in Bushell's expression suggested that would be a mistake. The man was too intelligent, too perceptive. Kendrick made a decision. "Yes," he said simply. "It's true." Bushell studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere features. "Brilliant," he said. "Absolutely brilliant. I've been thinking about something similar for months, but I couldn't figure out how to organize it." The Germans interrogate prisoners regularly, trying to stay current on RAF developments. Most chaps just refuse to answer, which is fine, but it's a missed opportunity. If we could coordinate a systematic misinformation campaign. He trailed off, his eyes distant, clearly thinking through possibilities. Kendrick felt a surge of excitement. He'd hoped to continue his deception operation in the camp, but he'd expected to have to convince the senior officers to support it. Instead, he'd found an ally who immediately grasped the potential. Over the following days, Kendrick and Bushell met regularly, usually during the exercise periods when conversations could be conducted, while walking the perimeter of the compound, away from potential eavesdroppers. They discussed the logistics of organizing a misinformation campaign involving hundreds of prisoners. The challenges were significant. First, they needed to identify which prisoners were being interrogated by German intelligence officers. Second, they needed to brief those prisoners on what false information to provide, ensuring some consistency while avoiding the appearance of coordination. Third, they needed to do all of this without alerting the German guards, who would certainly punish any organized resistance activity. And fourth, they needed to convince prisoners to participate, which meant overcoming the natural reluctance many felt about cooperating with interrogators, even falsely. Bushel's position as senior British officer gave him authority and access. He could call meetings, assign tasks, and communicate with prisoners throughout the compound without raising German suspicions. Kendrick's experience at Dulag Luft gave him expertise in interrogation techniques and an understanding of what kinds of misinformation would be most effective. Together, they began to build an organization. They recruited a small core group of trusted officers, men who understood the mission and could be relied upon to maintain security. Each of these officers was assigned to work with a group of prisoners, identifying those who were called for interrogation and briefing them on the deception operation. The briefings were necessarily brief and conducted in whispers during seemingly casual conversations. If the Germans ask about the new Lancaster bomber, tell them it's having problems with the rear turret. If they ask about fighter tactics, say we're focusing on close escort. If they ask about target priorities, mention oil refineries in Romania. The information was carefully crafted to be plausible but false, designed to mislead German intelligence without being obviously wrong. Kendrick and Bushel spent hours discussing what lies would be most effective, drawing on their knowledge of RAF operations and their understanding of German strategic concerns. Not every prisoner agreed to participate. Some felt that any cooperation with interrogators, even false cooperation, was dishonorable. Others worried about the consequences if the deception was discovered. But many embraced the opportunity to continue fighting the war from behind barbed wire. For men who felt helpless and useless, the chance to strike back at the enemy, even in this unconventional way, was deeply appealing. Within a month, Kendrick estimated that at least 50 prisoners in North Compound were actively participating in the misinformation campaign, with more being recruited regularly. The operation was expanding beyond anything he'd imagined at Dulag Luft. The Germans seemed oblivious. Intelligence officers continued to conduct interrogations, and prisoners continued to be called in for questioning about new aircraft, tactics, and operations. Some prisoners resisted, giving only name, rank, and serial number. But an increasing number appeared to cooperate, providing detailed information that the German interrogators recorded carefully. None of them realized that they were being systematically deceived, that the intelligence they were gathering was worse than useless. It was actively misleading. Kendrick felt a grim satisfaction every time he heard that another prisoner had successfully fed false information to the Germans. Each small deception was a tiny victory, a way of continuing the fight. But success brought new dangers. The more the operation expanded, the greater the risk of exposure. All it would take was one prisoner breaking under pressure and revealing the truth. One German interrogator becoming suspicious and investigating more carefully. One careless word overheard by the wrong person. Kendrick and Bushel implemented strict security protocols. Information was compartmentalized. Only a few people knew the full scope of the operation, and participants were instructed never to discuss it, where they might be overheard. But they both knew that security could never be perfect. They were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were high. If the Germans discovered what was happening, the consequences would be severe, not just for the organizers, but for all the prisoners in the camp. In August 1943, the operation faced its first serious test. A prisoner named Flight Lieutenant Morrison was called for interrogation and, following his briefing, told the German intelligence officer that the RAF was planning a major daylight raid on Berlin using heavy bomber formations without fighter escort. This was completely false. The RAF had no such plans, but it was plausible enough that the Germans took it seriously. Morrison returned to the compound and reported to Kendrick that the interrogator had seemed very interested, asking detailed follow-up questions about timing, numbers of aircraft, and approach routes. Kendrick felt both elation and anxiety. If the Germans believed Morrison's lie, they might redeploy fighter units and anti-aircraft defenses to protect Berlin, weakening defenses elsewhere. But they might also investigate further, cross-referencing Morrison's information with other sources, and discover inconsistencies that would expose the deception. For 2 weeks, Kendrick and Bushell waited tensely, watching for any sign that the Germans had become suspicious. But nothing happened. Interrogations continued as normal, prisoners continued to feed misinformation, and the Germans continued to record it all without apparent skepticism. Gradually, Kendrick allowed himself to believe that the operation was working, that they were actually succeeding in deceiving German intelligence on a significant scale. It was an intoxicating feeling, a sense of accomplishment that made the hardships of prison life more bearable. He was still a prisoner, still powerless in most ways, but he was also still a soldier, still fighting, still making a difference, and that made all the difference. Winter came early to Silesia that year, bringing bitter cold that seeped through the thin walls of the barracks and made every day a test of endurance. The prisoners huddled around improvised stoves made from Red Cross tins, burning whatever scraps of wood they could scavenge, but the cold was relentless. Kendrick barely noticed. He was too focused on the operation, which had grown beyond his wildest expectations. By November, more than 200 prisoners across multiple compounds were participating in the misinformation campaign, feeding carefully crafted lies to German interrogators. The operation had become so large that Kendrick and Bushell had created an entire organizational structure to manage it. Coordinators for each barracks, specialists who developed specific categories of false information, even a primitive quality control system to ensure consistency. The intelligence they were feeding the Germans covered every aspect of RAF operations. They reported fictional aircraft types, imaginary technological developments, non-existent tactical doctrines, and fabricated strategic plans. They described new radar systems that didn't exist, bombing techniques that had never been tested, and fighter modifications that were pure invention. Some of the lies were subtle, small distortions of truth that would be difficult to detect. Others were bolder, complete fabrications designed to send German intelligence down entirely wrong paths. Kendrick had no way of knowing how much of this misinformation was actually reaching German high command or influencing operational decisions. But he had to believe it was having an impact. The alternative was too dispiriting to contemplate. In late November, everything changed. Kendrick was summoned to Bushell's room for an urgent meeting. When he arrived, he found Bushell with 2 other senior officers, both looking grim. "We have a problem," Bushell said without preamble. "The Germans have arrested Flight Lieutenant Hawkins. He was taken from his barracks this morning by the Gestapo, not regular camp guards, but Gestapo. They also took all his personal effects and searched his room thoroughly." Kendrick felt his stomach drop. Hawkins was one of the coordinators, a key figure in the misinformation operation. If the Gestapo was involved, it meant the Germans suspected something serious. Do we know what they suspect? Kendrick asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Not specifically, Bushell replied. But Hawkins was interrogated 3 days ago about RAF Pathfinder tactics. He gave them the standard misinformation, told them we were using radio beacons that we're actually not using. It's possible the Germans checked his information against other sources and discovered it was false, or possibly they've been suspicious for a while, and Hawkins was simply the unlucky one they decided to investigate. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. If the Germans had discovered the deception, they would investigate thoroughly. They would interrogate other prisoners, cross-reference information, look for patterns. And eventually they would uncover the full scope of the operation. When that happened, the consequences would be catastrophic. "We need to shut down the operation," one of the other officers said. "Immediately. Tell everyone to stop cooperating with interrogators. Go back to name, rank, and serial number only." Bushell shook his head. "If we shut down suddenly, it will confirm German suspicions that something organized was happening. They'll investigate even more aggressively. We need to wind down gradually. Make it look natural." He turned to Kendrick. "What do you think? You started this. What's our best move?" Kendrick thought furiously, weighing options. Bushell was right that a sudden shutdown would be suspicious. But continuing the operation while the Germans were investigating was incredibly dangerous. "We scale back," Kendrick said finally. "We identify the prisoners who are most at risk, the ones who've been most active in the operation, and we tell them to become uncooperative if they're called for interrogation. Everyone else continues as before, but we stop developing new misinformation. We just repeat old information, things we've already told them. That way, if they're cross-referencing, they'll find consistency rather than contradictions. And we prepare for the worst. We destroy any written records, make sure no one has anything that could prove the operation was organized." The others nodded slowly. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than the alternatives. Over the next week, they implemented the scaled-back operation. Kendrick personally briefed the most exposed participants, warning them to be cautious. The tension in the compound was palpable. Everyone knew something was wrong, though most didn't know the details. Rumors spread. The Germans were planning a mass punishment. They were going to close the camp. They were going to separate the prisoners. None of it was true, but fear fed on uncertainty. Kendrick slept poorly when he slept at all, constantly expecting the Gestapo to come for him next. Every footstep in the corridor, every shouted command from the guards, sent his heart racing. Then, on December 3rd, Hawkins was returned to the compound. He looked haggard, thinner than when he'd left, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression. Bushell and Kendrick met with him privately as soon as possible. "They knew," Hawkins said, his voice hoarse. "They knew we were feeding them false information. They didn't know the full scope. They thought it was just a few of us acting independently. But they knew. They interrogated me for days, trying to get me to reveal who else was involved, whether it was organized. I told them nothing. I gave them name, rank, and serial number, and nothing else. They threatened me, said they'd charge me with espionage, said I'd be shot. But they didn't break me." Kendrick felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Hawkins hadn't revealed the operation's full scope, admiration for the man's courage, and dread about what would come next. "What did they say when they released you?" he asked. Hawkins shook his head. Nothing specific. Just that I was being returned to the compound, and that I should consider myself lucky. But there was something in the way the interrogator looked at me at the end. He said, "We know what you and your friends have been doing. It was clever, but it's over now. Any prisoner caught providing false information in the future will be treated as a spy, not as a prisoner of war." It was a warning. They're letting us know they're onto us. Bushell made the decision immediately. The operation is over. We shut it down completely, effective now. We pass the word to everyone. No more cooperation with interrogators. No more misinformation. Nothing. We go back to basic resistance. It's too dangerous to continue. Kendrick wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to keep the operation going. But he knew Bushell was right. They'd been lucky that the Germans hadn't uncovered the full scope of the deception. Pushing their luck further would be foolish. The misinformation campaign was over. In the weeks that followed, Kendrick struggled with a sense of loss. For 6 months, the operation had given him purpose, had made him feel like he was still contributing to the war effort, despite being a prisoner. Now that purpose was gone, and he was left with the grinding monotony of prison life. The same thin soup, the same cold barracks, the same barbed wire stretching to the horizon. He tried to occupy himself with other activities. He joined the camp theater group, helped with tunnel digging for escape attempts, taught mathematics to younger prisoners. But nothing filled the void left by the end of the misinformation campaign. Then, in January 1944, something unexpected happened. A new prisoner arrived in North Compound, a wing commander named Peters, who had been shot down only 2 weeks earlier. Peters brought news from the outside world, and one piece of news in particular caught Kendrick's attention. "There's been a lot of confusion in German Fighter Command lately," Peters said, during a general briefing about the state of the war. "We've noticed that their interceptors are often in the wrong places, that their defenses are sometimes concentrated on targets we're not actually attacking. Intelligence thinks the Germans have been getting bad information from somewhere. It's given us a real advantage in recent months." Kendrick felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took his breath away. The operation had worked. The misinformation he and hundreds of other prisoners had fed to German interrogators had actually reached German high command and influenced their operational decisions. All those carefully crafted lies, all that risk and stress and fear, it had made a difference. He'd been one man, powerless and imprisoned, but he'd found a way to fight back. And in his own small way, he'd helped win the war. He caught Bushell's eye across the room and saw the same realization, the same fierce satisfaction. They'd done something remarkable, something that would probably never be officially recognized or rewarded, but something that mattered. The war continued. Kendrick remained a prisoner at Stalag Luft III until May 1945, when advancing Soviet forces liberated the camp. He returned to England, was debriefed by RAF intelligence, and was quietly told that his misinformation operation had indeed been valuable, that it had contributed to Allied success in the air war over Europe. He was awarded a commendation, classified and never made public, and was asked to never speak about the operation. He agreed, understanding the need for secrecy. Some victories had to remain hidden. Years later, long after the war ended, Kendrick would sometimes think about those months at Dulag Luft and Stalag Luft III. He'd been shot down, captured, imprisoned, defeated in every conventional sense. But he'd refused to accept defeat. He'd found a weapon the Germans never expected: deception, wielded with precision and patience. He'd turned interrogation rooms into battlefields and fought a secret war that helped save lives and shorten the conflict. It wasn't the kind of heroism that made headlines or earned medals, but it was heroism nonetheless. And for Thomas Kendrick, that was enough.